Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
My name is Amat Levine, and I'm here to tell you about Black History Unveiled, a new podcast where we spotlight pivotal moments, influential figures, and groundbreaking movements from Black history across the globe. For example, in this first season, you'll hear about how the Louisiana Purchase, the moment when the U.S. nearly doubled in size, is tied to the greatest slave rebellion in history. Learn more about this and other historical events every week on Black History Unveiled. Black History Unveiled is a part of the worldwide Acast family, and you can listen on your preferred podcast platform.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.
Previously on the Söring system. Annabel sacrifices her free time to support Jens Söring. At his request, she compiles media packets and is involved in the campaign to discredit Terry Wright and his report. She plays a key role in making the Söring system work. When she starts to have doubts, she puts them aside. The Söring System, a podcast series from CCC Cinema and Television and Argonne Lab 2022. Please note, this podcast contains graphic descriptions of physical and sexual violence that are not suitable for children. Listener discretion is advised. Episode 7 of 8, System Error. Söring has been released and his story is once again attracting attention. Annabel begins to criticize him openly. As a result, she is forced out of the circle of friends. Criticism takes shape. The news breaks in the fall of 2019. Söring is being released. Annabel and the other members of the circle of friends can hardly believe it. It's finally happening, the goal that they have fought for so long.
That was an absolutely incredible moment. But then, of course, we all had to, collect ourselves and function as well, because there was so much work to do. We had to share the news on social media, and his longest standing supporter, she was just flooded with hundreds and hundreds of emails, and it was all a bit much. And I remember then sending an email to all my friends and everyone saying, we've done it, he's finally free. And then, of course, the waiting started for him to be extradited to Germany.
While Söring is held in an ICE detention center waiting to be extradited to Germany, he is able to make calls in order to get his affairs in order. He contacts Annabel shortly before 5 a.m. London time.
And it was funny because I picked up the phone and I heard his voice and I was so euphoric and I wanted to share my happiness with him. And he actually shut me up and say, listen, we have to function, because he had one free phone call and they are limited to 20 minutes before the phone cuts off. And he had to give me all this logistical information, the address of the detention center. So he said, okay, listen, I need you to function. You need to do this, that, and the other. You need to contact my lawyers, Steve Rosenfield and Steve Northup. So I dashed down the stairs. So my flat in London is spread across 2 floors. And because it was 5 a.m, I was euphoric and yet still half asleep and completely overwhelmed. And I didn't find a piece of paper, so I had to write everything down on my arm and my hand. It was absolutely incredible. And then I didn't go back to sleep or anything. I immediately sent off emails to the team members with Jens's instructions. And then, I got dressed and went to work.
During this time, as the circle of friends is joyously celebrating Söring's release. Andrew Hammel's article comes out.
And then I wrote the first article for the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, which came out on the 26th of November, 2019. And it was just totally random chance that Jens Söring and Elisabeth Haysen were released from prison that day. So, a lot of people came and clicked on my article, and it really obviously ruined Jens Söring's day. And that really just made me a central figure in the case from then on, because there was no other German journalist who had ever really expressed doubt or skepticism about Jens Söring's story.
Honestly, at the time, I didn't really take it seriously, and I don't think anyone else on the team did. Or maybe we did take it seriously, but we kind of pushed it aside because, at the end of the day, we had won. Jens was free. So, who cares whether a Mr. Hammel comes along and now claims, he's guilty? It didn't matter, really. And also, whenever there was pushback, our support for Jens grew stronger and we became more and more aggressive in our support for him. So it's not a situation where anyone on the team would have said, okay, let's sit down and read this essay and let's see what this guy has to say and give it a fair chance. It didn't work like that.
A short time later, the Wright report is posted online and is now available to the public.
If people want to do the right thing and they want to help Jens Söring because they believe he was locked up and he was actually innocent, right, then they see my report, for example, and they say, well, actually, things aren't quite right. They're not what he says happened, and yet they continue to support him. And then I think that's just human nature, because they would have to admit that they were wrong all along, and some people just don't want to do that.
Looking back, Annabel describes how, instead of sowing doubt, these kinds of attacks against Söring only serve to further strengthen the resolve within the circle of friends.
Whenever someone said something critical or when there were negative comments, for some reason that only served to, strengthen our belief and our fight on Jens's behalf. That's how it was. That's the dynamic. And I think what you feel is, we'll show them.
Psychologist and expert in group dynamics, Klaus Antons, classifies Annabel's statement as a symptom that is typical in collectives with a strong sense of solidarity, like Söring's circle of friends.
This is also an example of an autonomous group dynamic. When external pressure is applied to the group, the intergroup relationships become closer, stronger, more tight-knit, and any pre-existing conflicts fade away, at least for the time being. In this way, external pressure rarely breaks up a functioning group, but rather brings them much closer together.
The pressure grows. Annabel is still supporting Söring, even though the situation is starting to take a toll on her. An anonymous stalker begins writing Söring letters. According to the circle of friends, this stalker is most likely one of Söring's former fellow inmates. Eventually, Annabel also becomes a target of his attacks. This occurs when the circle of friends publishes a letter to the editor of the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, disputing an article written by Andrew Hammel.
So our letter to the editors was forwarded to Andrew, and that prompted Andrew to write and publish a second article in that newspaper, which was basically a reply to everything that we had raised in our letter to the editor. And Andrew's article went online, and in Andrew's article there was a link to our letter to the editor. And the newspaper had forgotten or had not removed my personal details. The letter contained my home address, my email address, my cell phone number. And what happened was, a couple of weeks later, I started receiving these horrible awful, disgusting letters in the mail. And that was a really difficult situation for me. I changed my cell phone number. I changed my email address. That was very, very horrible.
Annabel keeps some of the anonymous hate letters that contain horrendous, sexualized attacks against her, always in connection with her efforts on Söring's behalf. She goes to the police with the letters, but all they do is make copies of them and file them in their records. Still, her desire to fight for Söring outweighs her fears, no matter how strong the attacks against her and against Söring become. When Söring lands at Frankfurt Airport, Annabel is unable to be there. However, she meets up with him the next day in Hamburg, along with other members of the circle of friends. Söring is staying there temporarily with one of his supporters and her family.
And then all of a sudden, he was there. He stood in front of me. And we hugged each other and said hello. And in the lead up to that, I think my expectations were so high that in the end, it was a bit of a letdown because I didn't really feel anything, no profound happiness or anything. It was a very strange situation. And then we sat around, then we walked into the flat and we sat down at this huge wooden table, and it was filled with food, masses of food. And he sat at the end of the table and we were sort of like spread along. And what he then did, he looked at the table and he saw all this food and he said, I'm just going to have a coffee first because this is too much for me to handle.
According to psychologist Klaus Antons, what Annabel describes here, the disappointment that she felt when she finally met Söring in the free world, is a relatively common reaction. Söring's supporters have seen him as a hero fighting against injustice, in this case, the American justice system. While he has been in prison, almost none of his supporters were able to meet him in person. But that all changes once Söring returns to Germany.
Ja, natürlich macht man sich selbst immer Fotos von ihm.
Of course, even if you have actual pictures of this person, you still create your own mental image of them as this hero. And that image does not necessarily match up with who the person is in real life, or at the very least, you'll have to adjust your expectations. And at some point, you'll say, is this really the same person? Am I missing something?
And then at some point later in the afternoon, we were still sitting across the table and just chatting, and I think we might have all shared a glass of wine, I can't remember. But then all of a sudden, I burst into tears and I was crying and I couldn't believe it. And I thought, Jens Söring is sitting here with us and he's finally free. And then he hugged me and said, you don't have to feel ashamed or anything because everybody here has cried already. Everything that we had worked for all these years, and it was a tough job. It takes an emotional and psychological toll on you, this fight for someone's freedom. And everything that we had fought for had finally become true.
For Klaus Antons, these kinds of changes always mark the onset of an identity crisis for groups, which now have to confront a whole different set of questions.
Wollen wir jetzt als Gruppe noch zusammenbleiben, wo dieses
Do we want to stay together as a group now that we have achieved our goal? Now that that's over, is there something else for us to focus our energy on? Or will we go our separate ways? Is there anything still keeping us together? And I would venture a guess that the moment he arrived at the airport marked the start of a sort of identity crisis for the group.
The expulsion. Even though she doesn't always agree with his behavior, Annabel sticks firmly to her plan of supporting Jens Söring, until an incident finally causes her to start seriously doubting the integrity of his plans. In the foreword of his book Not Guilty, Söring accuses Elizabeth Haysom of murdering her parents. This version of the foreword appears in an updated edition of the book, which is published in December 2019, shortly after Söring's release. A few weeks later, Söring's attorneys receive a letter from a law firm representing Haysom. If Söring continues to claim that Haysom committed the murders, he will be sued for defamation. According to Annabel, at this time, he switches from one law firm in Bonn to another one. This switch makes it more difficult for Haysom to take legal action against him.
So Elizabeth Haysom's German lawyer had sent a letter to Jens Söring's longtime pro bono lawyers in Bonn, assuming that they were still mandated. And so they responded with quite a short letter saying, sorry, we are not mandated here. So in other words, Elizabeth's lawyer had no contact address for Jens Söring and wasn't able to serve legal mail on him.
According to Annabel, in order to make it impossible for Haysom's attorneys to send him any legal notices, he even considers registering a false address in a different city.
If I do that, then no attorney in the world will be able to find me because, when you live in Germany, you have to register your residency, and every town has a registry office. So theoretically, in order for a lawyer to find me and try and serve legal mail on me, they'd have to contact every single German town's registry office.
His claims, which run counter to court rulings and which he continues to make, violate Elizabeth Haysom's general right to privacy. This also includes the right to be left alone after being released from prison and returning to public life.
That was a profound shock to me because it just wasn't right. And I thought, I'm sorry, I've spent 3 years of my life trying to get you out of prison so that you can lead a nice, normal life. And now you're trying to do that. First of all, if you have nothing to hide, then why would you even do that? And secondly, how can you think that it's okay to take away someone else's rights? In this case, Elizabeth Haysom's right. It was wrong. And I sent him what I think was quite a strongly worded email. And I said, you can't do this. This is not okay. It's not in line with German regulations. And by the way, when you were paroled, you signed a document and with your signature, you confirmed that you were going to lead a life of uniform good behavior. So how is registering your residency in a different town where you don't really have a residence, how is that in line with your parole conditions?
In the end, Söring moves to Hamburg and complies with his obligation to register his address in Germany. However, over time, Söring and Annabel's relationship fractures. Soon, Annabel receives an email from Söring containing a scathing personal attack.
He basically accused me of rejecting people, new supporters that he had grown close to. And that, of course, was total nonsense because all I had done was I had raised criticism about certain behavior patterns, and others in his inner circle felt the same way, but I was the only one who spoke up about it.
She tries to call Söring and explain the situation, but he refuses to pick up the phone, avoiding confrontation. Annabel is familiar with this dynamic because she's not the first to experience it. During her time as part of the circle of friends, she has seen how Söring treats people who express even the slightest doubts about his innocence.
So in 2018, the producers of the documentary film Killing for Love, Karin Steinberger and Markus Vetter, gave an online interview alongside a podcast production they had participated in. And in that interview, they said, "We don't know who committed the murders." And Jens read the interview, it was sent to him, and he was absolutely fuming. He was furious because he wanted them and he had expected them to say, "We don't know who committed the murders, but we know it could not have been Jens Söring." they didn't do it, and he withdrew the friendship, distancing himself from them. And then later on, I think in 2019, they patched things up again.
Söring doesn't explicitly say as much in his email, but it's clear that Annabel has been ousted from the circle of friends. Söring ignores her, and suddenly the other members start avoiding her as well.
So what happens when someone stops playing along, when someone raises criticism, when someone, say, becomes uncomfortable for Jens, which happened to me as well? They basically get kicked off the team. It's as simple as that. I wasn't the first, and I'm sure I won't be the last. But what happens then is that all the people that you've spent years working alongside almost on a daily basis, and people with whom you've built friendships and exchanged personal stuff as well, from one minute to the next, they break off contact with you.
Excluded from the system. For Annabel, being excluded from Söring's circle of friends means losing the people who had become her closest friends over the past 3 years. People she had developed close relationships with after working together for so long towards a common goal, even if she recently started questioning whether or not they were doing the right thing.
I could never have called anyone in the team or sent an email to anyone in the team to say, but wait a minute, is he actually really innocent?
It only becomes clear to Annabel later that the group was a kind of cult of personality around Söring.
When you get kicked off a team and when you're being abandoned by everyone else on the team from one minute to the next, and you've got nothing left, then it's an unspeakable situation, actually. And in the wake of all of this, and in the months that followed, I've often thought that the situation is pretty much comparable to a religious or a personality cult. Basically, Jens Söring was at the center of everything, and everything, really everything, revolved around him. You weren't allowed to express criticism, and of course, there is no way that you could ever have doubted his innocence.
Klaus Antons describes why, from a psychological perspective, groups tend to form around individuals like Söring.
Ja, indem ich mich in ihn hineinversetze.
Because I empathize with him and say to myself, he does things that I wouldn't dare to do, or things that I could never do. And by identifying with him, I can also share in some of his fame. And I think that this basic dynamic, which we see a lot, also played a role in the formation of this group of supporters.
For Annabel, being kicked out of the group is extremely stressful. She gets sick, withdraws, stops going online in order to avoid seeing any news about Söring. She is embraced by her family and friends, even though before her break with Söring, she would sometimes go weeks without speaking to them.
My friends, they were interested in hearing more about the case at the beginning, but they also soon started to, witness just how my involvement in Jens Söring's fight for freedom was emotionally and psychologically draining as well. And of course, they felt firsthand that it was very time-consuming as well, and very, very stressful. It wears you down. And thinking about all my friends, without naming every single person individually, they were always there for me when I needed them. And same goes for my family as well. It's a very strange dynamic, because whenever Jens suffered, then in turn we, as his circle of friends, his Freundeskreis, we suffered as well. And in turn, also my family and my friends then suffered.
However, even though her friends and family expressed doubts about Söring, Annabel refuses to listen for a long time, even when it was coming from the people who were closest to her. Looking back, she tries to understand why she acted the way she did.
I remember giving my mum a few of his books to read. And she read one of his books called Nicht schuldig, not guilty. And she read it. And I remember speaking with her on the phone. And she was actually quite agitated. She said to me, "Well, I read the book, Annabel, and you know what? He is a real criminal." She said, he went on the run, he committed check fraud, and actually he was bragging in his book about the fact that he came up with this highly sophisticated check fraud scheme. He's a real criminal. I'm laughing now. I wasn't laughing when she told me that, because we, as this circle of friends, as this Freundeskreis, we always had the most amazing excuses for every single thing that, he had done wrong or the crimes that he had committed.
Over the years, Jens Söring styles himself as a freedom fighter, a prisoner who writes several books during his time behind bars, who is looking for publicity, who finds a number of famous supporters, and establishes a loyal network. A man fighting against the system, and anyone who criticizes him is merely a bug in the system.
Das Wichtige scheint mir zu sein.
For me, the key here seems to be he not only has to serve as a hero figure. I think in this case in particular, this hero figure also has to embody some kind of skill or ability that I wish I had, and is also somehow a bit creepy or scary as well. Someone who takes these destructive impulses that all of us have somewhere inside of us and who acts on them, who brings them out into the open.
Threats. On the one hand, Annabel describes Söring as volatile and impulse-driven. At the same time, she has seen him be strategic and manipulative. According to her, Söring carefully selects which person has access to which information. This applies not only to journalists, but also to his supporters. At times, he even goes so far as to put words in their mouths. In October 2017, while he is still in prison, Jens Söring writes an email to the German ambassador Peter Wittig and former German President Christian Wolff, both of whom are set to petition the parole board on his behalf. In the email, he refers to Christian Wolff as his honorary probation officer. He describes exactly how he wants Wolff to present his arguments to the board. We have no record of what Wolff actually says. At the same time, also in October 2017, Söring has an interview in Stern magazine. In it, he lays out the way in which he distributes information.
I write emails. I compose letters. Most of the people who try to help me do so voluntarily. They're not paid. I don't have any money. That means I do as much work for them as I can in advance in order to make it as easy for them as possible. After all, as I said, these are mainly people like the DNA experts, for example, or Sheriff Harding. They don't get paid for their efforts, and I feel it is my duty to do as much prep work as I can to make it as easy as possible for them to draw up these reports.
For Annabel, what Söring describes here as prep work takes on a much greater significance.
So Jens Söring completely controls what people get to see in terms of the case files and all the documents that he's created himself. That is true not just for journalists or third parties, it's also true for his circle of friends. I'd be extremely surprised if anybody on his current team of supporters has been given access to all of the documents. In a way, I probably had a bit of a privilege because as the person in charge of this vast document archive, I had access to all these documents that most people have never even seen, let alone read.
Hardly anyone knows more about Söring's affairs than Annabel, which is also what makes her a threat to him. In summer of 2020, after she has left the circle of friends, Söring accuses her of going behind his back.
What he did is he sent me emails with screenshots of hateful posts that people had put on social media. And I kept thinking, what is going on here? Jens Söring has always received a lot of online hate. And, while I was part of the team and in charge of his English language Facebook, we would frequently delete hateful comments and then block those who posted it.
According to Annabel, Söring accuses her of posting negative comments about him and the members of the Circle of Friends online under a pseudonym. As critical comments pop up on websites that discuss the Söring system, members of the Circle of Friends go through and have them deleted. Despite the false accusations, Annabel also tries to have these negative posts quickly deleted.
And during that time, Andrew has a blog on his website. And I remember at the time reading Andrew's blog entries and then reading all the comments that had been posted on there. And there was some hate on Andrew's website as well, or some stuff that was, out of order. And I remember sending Andrew an email at the time. This was still under my alias when Andrew and I were exchanging emails, and I hadn't revealed my true identity to him. And I said, can you please, delete those comments?
Annabel explains that she was still trying to help Söring and his group, even after having been kicked out of the Circle of Friends. Nevertheless, she receives threats.
And then the situation escalated. He got his attorney to contact me on the phone, on my landline, on my cell phone, on my email addresses. And at some point, one of the emails said, I have an appointment with the criminal prosecutor in Hamburg, and you are a suspect in this. And I can't even find words to describe how I felt. I had spent 3 years of my life trying to help someone, and now they're accusing me of having done something like that. So I was completely overwhelmed, and I was actually shaking, and I called my former boss at the time, a lovely attorney, and I said to her, I need help, I can't handle this. And she said, don't worry, and she dictated one sentence to send as a reply, which I did, and then I blocked the email addresses and the phone numbers on my devices to make sure that I wouldn't be bothered with this anymore, because I felt harassed, very much harassed by everything.
The book. In his book, Return to Life, Söring makes these incidents, which he refers to as betrayals, public in September 2021. He doesn't refer to Annabel by name, but he describes her instead as a former supporter who knew everything about him after years of excessive involvement. In the end, they decide not to take legal action against her. Terry Wright is also mentioned in Söring's new book. He describes Wright as a retired British detective who allegedly published a document that was subjective in terms of both tone and content online on an anonymous hate site. This document, however, is nowhere to be found.
After I submitted my report to the governor, I did receive some contact emails from, I think 2, maybe 3, but there was definitely 2 people who implied that they had a passing interest in the case. But in actual fact, I knew already that one of them was Söring's lawyer and another one was, shall we say, a fan of Söring's. But they pretended that they had studied the case over the years because they had a passing interest in it. And they were just trying to find out about me, really.
Wright does not respond to the messages from Söring's team. In his book, Söring describes Andrew Hamel as a Texan blogger. Hamel tries not to take Söring's attacks against him too seriously.
I found it kind of amusing, frankly. First of all, you can tell that he's got excellent advice from his PR team. He called me the Texan blogger. And so both Texas and blogging sound totally discreditable to most Germans. Jens Söring probably really dislikes me, and the people close to him really dislike me. I've tried to keep, and I don't want to attack him personally. I don't know Jens Söring. I've never met him. And the thing is, he and his people around him, who I call Team Söring, they have been looking into me, and they've been trying to find some reason why I have a hidden agenda. But I don't have a hidden agenda. They've looked really hard for 2 years. They've probably spent thousands of euros, and they haven't found anything out because there's nothing there.
Transparency is important to Andrew Hammel. On his website, he has published his resume, which states that, among other things, he is a former American attorney, a legal translator, and a former assistant professor at the University of Dusseldorf. In the U.S., Hammel worked as a defense lawyer for people who were facing the death penalty, a form of punishment that he opposes. In Return to Life, Söring depicts Hammel as a defender of the American legal system who has treated him unfairly for many years. He also accuses Hammel of having contacted his supporters and close friends, urging them to turn on Söring. Hammel responds to the accusations.
And I said, listen, I know you like Jens Söring, but he's lying about his case, and you are broadcasting those lies to millions of people. And this, when I say lie, this is not a gray area. These are proven, certifiable lies about his case that you are helping him reach millions of people with. And I think that's totally irresponsible.
In his book, Söring accuses Hammel of being solely interested in a public confrontation in order to generate press coverage. The fact is that his analysis of Söring's case has not only attracted a lot of visitors to his blog, but also led him to publish articles in several daily newspapers in Germany.
I get angry emails 2 or 3 times a week saying, why are you persecuting him? He's trying to build up his life in Germany, and you should just let him alone. He served 33 years in prison. What more do you want from him? I bet you wish they'd executed him, etc. And usually I don't respond, but if the person seems to be, very upset, I'll respond and I'll say, I've kept my criticisms to his arguments and to his assertions.
Söring in the media. One thing that Andrew Hammel repeatedly criticizes is the German media's treatment of Söring. He even submitted a complaint to the German broadcaster ZDF after they aired an interview with Jens Söring on a popular topical late-night show hosted by Markus Lanz on May 14, 2020. In his book, Return to Life, Söring also mentions Lanz, including him in a list of other journalists who apparently have all come to the same conclusion.
Like the majority of journalists before him, Markus Lanz quickly realized that it was impossible to come to a final conclusion as to my guilt or innocence. At the same time, many came to the conclusion that I had by no means been convicted of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt, so that I had to be considered not guilty, at least in the legal sense.
When the talk show airs, Annabel is no longer part of Jens Söring's circle of friends. However, during the preparations, she is still an active member of his team.
And so we were talking on the phone, and at some point during the conversation, he said to me, okay, sorry, we have to stop now. I have to get dressed, put on my running shoes, and then I'm able to catch Markus Lanz. And then we're going to go for a run together. And prior to the recording of the show, there were several meetings to discuss the content of the show. And of course, Jens Söring's focus was always that he wanted a pardon by the media. And because the governor of Virginia had not granted him a pardon. And he kept saying to me, I want revenge. When I can show that I'm innocent, they're going to be embarrassed because they didn't give me the pardon that I deserve. And I think in terms of trying to get a pardon by the media, his appearance on the Markus Lanz show was meant to be the first big pillar that would cement his media campaign. And just like every other team of journalists, Markus Lanz and his team, they also received one of the specially prepared media packs. And then the show was recorded, and one problem with it was that Jens Söring, under German law, is no longer allowed to say that Elizabeth Haysom personally killed her parents. because he's the convicted murderer and she is not. And so I think, as far as I understand it, they spend a lot of time pondering ways on how they could, phrase questions, because that would get him into serious legal trouble if he did.
In the interview, Söring repeats his well-worn version of the events in front of a large audience. For example, he claims that the fact that he was released proves that the authorities in Virginia believe he was innocent, or at least doubted that he was guilty. Furthermore, he says that he hopes that Elizabeth Haysom can finally tell the truth. Other than Söring, the only other guest in the studio is a sociologist and expert in resocialization. Furthermore, the program also includes clips from an interview with Söring supporter John Grisham, making it a show that is entirely tailored to Söring and his version of events.
And I think basically the general PR strategy that Söring and his team say, look, this is no longer a question of innocence or guilt. And that's something that they tell journalists as well prior to interviews. The problem with that is he then gets a platform that allows him to basically spread his version of the story and imply his innocence. And I think that's highly problematic.
Hamill publishes the complaint he sent to ZDF on his website.
And so I think also people realized as of that point, there's this crazy obsessed American who apparently has nothing better to do with this life than constantly complain and bitch about how we're giving the kid glove treatment to Jens Söring. And, I am that crazy American, and I did complain and bitch. But I think that also had a pretty significant impact on later coverage of the case. Because now, every time he's interviewed, they at least make sure to mention that he remains guilty, that he lost all of his appeals, that he's a convicted double murder. Markus Lanz didn't do any of that stuff. And so Markus Lanz was an image of how German coverage of the case would have gone if nobody had questioned Jens Söring's story. And so I wanted to get in there and say, this is wrong. You have to change your approach.
After Hamill submits his complaint to ZDF, Söring still does not experience any major pushback. According to Annabel, the reason why Söring has such an easy time manipulating the media is due to the fact that the opposing side has mostly remained silent for all these years. Söring is free. What are his plans for the future? What's next for Annabel, Terry Wright, and Andrew Hamill? This will be the topic of the 8th and final episode of this series.
So it seems like the most realistic possibility for finding work in Germany, the media industry. And in the media world, my lack of formal education and work experience don't matter. In fact, I have some work experience in the media industry, 10 books, and dozens of TV appearances.
The Söring System. Episode 7 of 8. System Error. Our narrator is Karen Cifarelli. You also heard the voice talents of Michael S. Roginski and Seamus Sargent. This has been a production of Argonne Lab and CCC Cinema and Television 2022.
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
My name is Amat Levine, and I'm here to tell you about Black History Unveiled, a new podcast where we spotlight pivotal moments, influential figures, and groundbreaking movements from Black history across the globe. For example, in this first season, you'll hear about how the Louisiana Purchase, the moment when the U.S. nearly doubled in size, is tied to the greatest slave rebellion in history. Learn more about this and other historical events every week on Black History Unveiled. Black History Unveiled is a part of the worldwide Acast family, and you can listen on your preferred podcast platform.
Acast helps creators launch, grow, and monetize their podcasts everywhere. Acast.com.